Dr. Lott, welcome to Constitutional Chats. We look forward to hearing your thoughts today on today's topic, and then we'll turn it over to our panel for questions.
Good. Well, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it. It's kind of hard to talk about this subject without mentioning what's been happening in Israel recently. We just had this horrible attack that happened there. One of the things that's changed over time in Israel has been its gun control laws and the regulations that they've had. Even before Israel became a country, they had terrorist attacks that they were having to go and deal with. And the policy for decades, when you'd have these types of terrorist attacks, would be to go and put more police, more military on the streets in order to try to protect people. But what they realized at some point is it was simply impossible for them to go and hire and put enough uniformed people on the street in order to go and protect people. And what you see is a huge change in the types of attacks that occurred before and after 1972. Prior to 1972, virtually all the terrorist attacks in the country involved machine guns. After 1972, virtually all the terrorist attacks involved bombs. And there's a simple reason for that. In 1972, they began to allow civilians to carry concealed handguns. And about 2 decades ago, in 2002, they had over 10% of the adult Jewish population was licensed to be able to go and carry. Since then, they've been more restrictive. By 2022, only about 3% of Jewish adults were able to go and carry. But what you would find is that before they allowed civilians to carry, what you would find is that these terrorists had huge strategic advantages. They would go, if you had, let's say, a couple police officers on a bus, the terrorists could wait for the officers to leave before they attack, or they could move on to another target, or they could try to take out the officer that was on the bus that was there. When you allowed civilians to be able to go and carry, that took away the strategic advantages that these terrorists had, because if they were to go after the officers that were there, they'd reveal their position. And they'd have to worry that maybe somebody behind them or to the side, somebody that they weren't able to go and identify as being able to go and carry, would be able to go and stop them. So that actually made the job of the officers safer in those circumstances. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, they've become more restrictive in recent years on this. And so you had a situation where you had lots of civilians over the weekend who were facing these attackers and not being able to go and stop them, whether they be at the festival or whatever, not being able to go and fight back. We have, just in comparison, we have, if you take out California and New York, which have had very restrictive concealed carry laws, over 10.4% of the adult population in the other states in the United States have concealed carry permits. And that's not even counting the fact that 27 states now have what's called constitutional carry, where it's not even necessary for somebody to have a permit to be able to go and carry. So the rate that people are carrying is obviously much higher than that. And you would never know. I mean, if you're in a state like Pennsylvania, for example, over 14% of the adult population is a concealed carry permit. You could go to a restaurant or a movie theater or a grocery store, and very likely that somebody next to you is carrying, but you would never know that that's the situation. We try to go and do things like adopt gun-free zones in order to try to make people safer. But take something like the Covenant school shooting that occurred in March this year. In Tennessee, schools are gun-free zones. There's a 6-year prison penalty if you or I were to go and violate such a rule there. The problem is, for you or I to do it, 6 years in prison is a really major penalty. It would completely change our lives in very fundamental ways. But let's say that the murderer in this situation had lived, that they had survived. Obviously, they were shot to death by police when they arrived, but they murdered 6 people. So let's say they were facing 6 life sentences or 6 death penalties. Does anybody seriously think that the person would think to themselves, well, I can live with 6 life sentences or 6 death penalties, but you put an additional 6 years onto the penalty there, and that's going to keep me from going and doing this type of crime. It's just not serious. You just don't have any marginal deterrence that's there that's going to be something that's going to prevent them from committing these types of crimes. And what happens then is that these laws only assure that these attackers don't have to worry that there'll be some law-abiding citizen there who's going to be able to go and stop them. It makes it safer for the criminals rather than the people who are going to be the victims that are there. And anybody who reads the diaries or manifestos for these mass murders sees time after time after time that they take into account whether or not their victims are going to be able to go and defend themselves. They want to go and get media attention. And they know the more people they kill, the more media attention that they're going to be able to go and get. And if they go to a place where their victims aren't going to be able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be able to go and kill more people than they would have been able to do otherwise. In fact, while the Biden administration has refused to release the Covenant School Shooters Manifesto from March, which is extremely unusual, what we do know from the Nashville police chief is that that murderer actually had another target as their primary target, a mall, but they had decided not to go there because they had armed people at that mall who could stop the attacker. And so they went after the school because they thought it was a soft target. Now, I've been asked to go and talk briefly about the New Mexico ban that the governor had put in place there. And, you know, when she made the ban for Albuquerque and the county that's in, which is the most populous county in New Mexico, she pointed to several murders of young people over the last few months, basically road rage type incidents. The most recent one was an 11-year-old who had been killed. But what she's banning in that case are people who have legally carried guns, people with permanent concealed handguns in New Mexico. And the problem is that none of those law-abiding people were involved in those attacks. These were basically gangs that were firing these guns, people who it was illegal for them to go and carry the guns to begin with. And, you know, and the thing is, if you look at the behavior of permit holders in New Mexico, they are extremely law-abiding. Permit holders, if you look at the 3 years that we have data, the most three years, 2019, 2020, and 2021, New Mexico has about 45,000 concealed carry permit holders. Only one permit holder over that entire 3 years had their permit revoked for any type of violation. And so, I mean, you're talking about an extremely law-abiding group. In fact, whether it's the police chief for Albuquerque or for the sheriff for the county there, both of them have said this ban on being able to go and carry would do nothing to go and stop the violence because these are not the people that are involved in the violence. In fact, when the governor made her announcement there, I looked up some stories, and you can find stories where, in fact, within the week before her ban, somebody with a concealed carry permit had actually stopped a road rage incident that had occurred. And so, you know, here you have a situation where none of these permit holders were responsible for any of these crimes that she's pointing to. They're extremely law-abiding. And on top of that, they were actually useful in stopping crimes that were occurring. One of the other things is that it seems pretty obvious to me why you have the problem of violent crime in Albuquerque and New Mexico. And that is, they have very few police. Albuquerque has one of the lowest per capita number of police of any comparable city in the country. The Albuquerque police chief has been on record saying that you would have to double the number of police in Albuquerque in order to get them to the average per capita number of police officers for cities in the country. In fact, there's been concerns in Albuquerque that they can't even answer the phone calls because of lack of staffing there for people who are calling for emergencies, let alone getting police out there in order to go and protect people. You have very left-wing district attorney for the county there who's refusing to prosecute violent criminals, someone who Soros has backed. And so rather than going and saying, look, to go and solve these problems, maybe we need more police, maybe we need to go and criticize the district attorney for not prosecuting violent criminals. The solution is to go and take away guns from law-abiding citizens who are not causing any of these problems and are actually helping when the police can't be there. We're in this weird world right now where you have Democratic politicians who are making it so that law enforcement isn't able to go and properly do their job to protect people. And at the same time, they're not allowing law enforcement to properly do their job. They're trying to make it so that civilians then are not able to go and protect themselves. And the bottom line is that if my research convinces me of anything, there's two groups of people who benefit the most from being able to go and have guns. They're the people who are the most likely victims of violent crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor Blacks who live in high crime urban areas. The very people who are the most likely victims of violent crime are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. And the other group of people who are people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about young males doing the attack. And when a young man attacks a woman or an elderly person, there's a much larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in the ability to go and defend themselves when you're talking about somebody who's relatively weaker physically. So I could go on for more, but I think that's about how long I was asked to talk for. But I appreciate you having me on, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Lott. And you've just done so much research on this over the years, and your empirical evidence that you have come up with is just very, very compelling. And we just really thank you for being on with us today. I'm going to go ahead and toss it to Jewel, one of our panelists here. And I know Jewel has got some great questions lined up for you.
Hello, thanks for everything so far. So I have a bunch of questions and try to come at it a little differently. First of all, when states are placing restrictions on gun usage in general, how is it justified? How is it justified constitutionally originally? Do you know when school zones, gun-free zones, when things like that were able to be enforced and limit the Second Amendment in that way?
Okay. I'm not 100% sure I follow the question, but look, we've done work on school shootings in the United States. There are 20 states that to varying degrees allow teachers and staff to be able to carry concealed handguns. You have states like Utah and New Hampshire where any teacher or staff member with a permit concealed handguns automatically allowed to carry on school property there. You have other states like Texas where about 40% of the schools in the state have armed teachers or staff. Oklahoma is similar. And so you have a broad range there in terms of the percentage of schools which are covered. One of the things you see, if you look at all the school shootings, anything from an accidental discharge all the way up to a mass public school shooting over the period of time from 2000 on, is that all attacks where anybody's been wounded or killed, every single one has occurred at schools where teachers and staff aren't allowed to carry. And as
So
I
this that
mentioned
goes right to my
before, what you
question
find-
of when did we justify public property being a gun-free zone? Has that been a long time? When did we decide that public property could be gun-free zones?
Right. Well, for schools, there was original legislation that got passed at the beginning of the Clinton administration. The Supreme Court struck it down on technical grounds, and then it was readopted and put into law in 1995. And that's the Federal Safe School Zone Act that you have there. So, it's not something
I didn't realize it was
forever, but
that
it's
hasn't been a
something
long
that's
time.
been
I did not
around.
realize that.
Good. It's not something that's been around forever there. And if you have a concealed carry permit, you've been able to go and still carry on those grounds. But otherwise, there's a 1,000-foot rule that's around the schools. Interesting.
And we've seen no empirical evidence in favor of that, as you just showed. Another question that has to do with evidence for control. Do we see the best argument for any form of control is what? I mean, you're studying it from the positive side, of course. You've presented us these statistics.
Not studying from the positive side. My views have changed.
No, I'm saying you've studied it and you've showed us these statistics. It seems from a constitutional standpoint, most of us are of the same constitutional opinion here. It's almost hard for us to understand how people of the other mindset are arguing for the gun control, which seems to create more violence.
Pretty easy to understand where they're coming from on that. They see bad things that happen. They think if I can only take away the guns, bad things won't happen. And, to a lot of extent, it's understandable why they have the views that they do. We did a deep dive in 2021 on media coverage across the country on gun crime type issues. If you take the 5 largest newspapers in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, they had about over 2,700 news stories about gun crimes that were occurring. By contrast, the total from those 5 newspapers for people using guns defensively was 10 news stories. And most of those had something go wrong in terms of the wrong person was shot or something bad happened that was there. You throw in CNN and MSNBC and you won't find one single defensive gun use story that was covered. And so it's not too surprising. A lot of people can think that they're very well read, that they follow the news very carefully. They read the New York Times and Washington Post religiously. They go and they watch CNN and MSNBC. And so they constantly hear about bad things that happen with guns, never hear about the benefits. And so it's not too surprising that they have the views that they do. Few people would know that best evidence we have indicates that people use guns defensively to stop crime about 5 times more frequently than guns are used in the commission of crime. So I'll give you an example. If you look at all the news coverage in 2021, there are over 2,000 news stories in all the different media about defensive gun uses. Most of those involve instances where the attacker was killed. About 45% of those involve, 42% of those involve instances where the attacker's been wounded. And about 4% of them involve cases of brandishing a gun, where simply showing the gun stopped the attack. but most of those involved instances where the attacker was held at gunpoint until the criminal until the police arrived. Now, here's the problem. Research indicates that, in fact, about 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun sufficient to go and stop the attack. So in reality, 95% involve those, but of the cases that get covered, only about 4%. Why the difference? Well, I think it's pretty easy to understand. You don't need to have a conspiracy story to go and understand why the media covers these things the way they do. If you're editor of a news bureau and you have two stories that come across your desk, in one case, there's a dead body on the ground. In another case, let's say a woman brandishes a gun, criminal runs away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground. You're not even sure what type of crime would have been committed. Which story are you going to pick as being more newsworthy? I think anybody would go and pick the dead body on the ground as being much more newsworthy than the other story that's there. Now, the point that people need to understand is that what makes something newsworthy doesn't necessarily mean it reflects reality that's there, that it can give people a very biased view of how the world works. Now, there are lots of things that one can point to in terms of media bias that's more difficult, not benign explanations for them. On our website at crimeresearch.org, we collect literally many dozens and dozens of cases in recent years where people with permanent concealed handguns have stopped what otherwise would have been a mass public shooting, according to police. And yet these cases rarely get national news coverage. They may only get small local news coverage there. You look at something like, people may remember the Pulse nightclub shooting near Orlando, Texas, at the time, Orlando, Florida. At the time, it was the worst mass public shooting in the United States. Just a week afterwards, there was a similar attack that was attempted in South Carolina at a nightclub. The person had shot 3 people, was shooting at a 4th when a concealed carry permit holder seriously wounded the attacker and ended the attack. He still had 125 rounds of ammunition on him when he was stopped. And yet, even though the Pulse nightclub shooting was still getting worldwide news attention at that point, nobody covered. There was no national or international coverage of the attack in South Carolina. The difference between Florida and South Carolina is Florida was one of 10 states that banned people be able to carry permanent concealed handguns in places that got more than 50% of their revenue from alcohol. And South Carolina, fortunately, was one of the 40 states that allowed people to be able to carry in those types of places. So somebody was there in order to go and stop the attack. But I mean, I can give you lots of examples like that where, you would think that the debate that we have right now in the United States would be very different if a couple things were true. If once in a while the media would mention the attacks that do occurred in places where guns were banned, and they would mention that some of these attempted attacks were stopped by civilians with permanent concealed handguns. And so you ask why people have the views that they do on these things. I don't blame them per se if they constantly hear about bad things that happen and rarely, if ever, hear about the benefits. Is it very surprising that people think if I just get rid of guns, these bad things won't happen? And they don't think about the things that the defensive gun uses that won't occur.
Yes, thank you so much. The amount of information that you have is great as you present to everybody. Another question along the same line as I try to make it more applicable to everybody on this podcast to be able to talk about. Do you ever see, and you mentioned your website, which is great, the website where so you could say it again as you answer the question, but on social media particularly, there's generally, when anything happens with guns, people are going to start quoting statistics. And I believe that oftentimes those statistics are incorrect. Do you ever see one? I'll give you an example of without a source because just for certain reasons. But there's an oftentimes statistic which says that many will quote saying that even a concealed carry, a permitted gun user, will actually cause an escalation of event and they cause more violence. And that is actually quoted all the time in online arguments. Do you see statistics that are false often in your work that go against the truth of the statistics that you find?
Well, that's what we put up on our website at crimeresearch.org. We're basically a group of academics and researchers who've done a lot of work on various aspects of crime. And we know the truth about these numbers. And so there's lots of misinformation out there. So one of the claims that we frequently hear that's related to what you're saying is that people should behave passively when they're confronted by a criminal. And there's a kernel of truth to it, but it's very misleading. There's something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, which for over 40 years has surveyed about 100,000 people each year. And if you look at passive behavior compared to all forms of active resistance together, passive behavior is indeed slightly safer. The problem is that it's very misleading because under the heading of active resistance, you're lumping together all sorts of different types of behavior. So for example, for a woman, by far the most dangerous course of action for her to take if she's confronted by a criminal is to go and use her fists. And that's usually because of the large strength difference on average that exists between men and women. The second most dangerous thing for a woman to do is to run away. Now, if a woman can run away and escape, that's great. But the problem is women tend to be relatively slower runners than men are. And in the process of being tackled and subdued, they often can be seriously injured there. And additional violence can follow that. If you break down the different things, what you find is that having a gun is by far the safest course of action for everybody. It's particularly true for women and the elderly. Women who have a gun are about women who behave passively are about 2.4 times more likely to end up being seriously injured than a woman who has a gun. And so, one can go and say, active resistance as a whole isn't great, but if by far the safest course of action is to have a gun. And that is just one example. You talk about escalating type things. One of the claims that you frequently hear is that if you use a gun, it can be taken away from you and used against you. Bizarrely, the data that's used for that is data from police officers, where police are they'll go and say that in any given year, you can have someplace between 27 and 50 police officers who are murdered. And you could get anything from 0 to 5 of those cases involve the police officer being killed with their own gun. And they'll go and say, see the high rate. I mean, maybe you could have maybe 15% of police officers in a year, the high could be killed with their own gun. The problem is that's very misleading in multiple ways. One is what happens is that a police officer has to be willing to get into physical contact with the attacker. If you use a gun defensively and you take a concealed carry class, one of the things that you're going to be told is you're not the police. Your job isn't to go and arrest the suspect there. The benefit that you get from having a permanent concealed handgun is to maximize the distance between yourself and the attacker. If a woman actually has to get into physical contact with her attacker, she's very likely lost control of the situation at that point and is likely to be in trouble in any case. But a police officer can't just brandish his gun, watch the criminal run away and think his job is done. He has to chase after the person. And the problem is that criminals will go and attack the police officer if they think they have a chance of escaping there. And so what you want to look at is the rate the police officers are attacked, physically assaulted. And what you find is that there's about 32,000 times each year that police officers are physically assaulted. About 16,000 of those result in serious medical injuries that require hospitalization. And so what you're talking about is, maybe 5 cases a year out of 32,000 times that they're attacked. So it's very rare there.
Wow, that is a great job of showing exactly what I asked. Thank you, about how the statistics are misrepresented and played with in order for us to get these talking points. It's an important topic, as you know, for so many reasons, but one of the reasons is we're talking about people's lives. And when these things, these lives, these things, when they are not true, when they are lies, they result in greater loss of life. So it is a sober conversation. Getting to back to certain amounts of legality, executive power from the governor when issuing executive orders. What do we normally see that governor's power being in this case? So this is a question from Tova. So the question is, what's the general authority of a governor when it comes to issuing executive orders? And I guess meaning pertaining to gun rights.
Right. Well, I mean, it depends on the state. It depends what types of executive orders you're talking about. So for example, after Hurricane Katrina, you had New Orleans, for example, confiscating people's guns. You end up having to have a state law passed there that made it so that they couldn't go and do that type of thing in the future. In New Mexico, there's like no type of provision there for the governor just to override existing state laws with regard to concealed carry. And so even the state attorney general there, who's a Democrat, refused to defend her executive order that she had. She's changed the executive order after a Biden administration federal judge indicated that he was likely to go against her. She's changed it so that the ban would only apply to government property and parks. My own guess is she's going to face a similar problem there too. She just can't change the law. I mean, you have legislation. If she wants to go and get the state legislature to go and pass a new law that would ban people from being able to go and carry in public parks, or buildings, she can go and do that. But it just executives, it depends on the state, and it depends on what type of law you're talking about them trying to override.
Have we seen any regulation that a state has passed in recent history on guns go to the Supreme Court and be overturned, that it's violating the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, sure, of course. You had a case last year, the state of New York versus Bruin. 7 states, including New York and California and Maryland and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Hawaii, and Delaware had rules that said for getting a concealed carry permit, you had to be a certain age, you had to pass a background check, you had to pay a fee, you had to get training. But then on top of that, you had to go and explain to some public official why you had a need for being able to go and protect yourself and your family. And they would rarely grant permits in those places. California, you have, maybe about 0.4% of the adult population with a concealed carry permit. New York was similar. By contrast, as I mentioned earlier, outside of New York and California, you had about 10.4% of the adult population with a concealed carry permit. So you can see the difference, 10.4% versus 0.4%. And the thing is also, not only did they rarely grant permits, but the people that they granted it to were often wealthy, politically connected individuals. So I was able to, a few years ago, get a list of all the concealed carry permit holders in Los Angeles County They had granted permits to 341 people out of about 8.5 million adults in Los Angeles County. So you can see how rare it was. But what you found was that only about 7% of the permit holders were women. In the rest of the country, about 30% of permit holders are women. In Los Angeles County, only about 6% of the permit holders were Black. That's about half their share of the population there. Nationwide, about 13% of permit holders are Black. And about 6.5% of the permit holders were Hispanic. About 54% of the population in Los Angeles County at that time were Hispanic. So is it just that women don't face criminal attacks in Los Angeles County, that they're not stalked or threatened, or that Blacks in Los Angeles County, compared to the rest of the country, just don't face threats? No, it's just that the people who got permits were wealthy individuals, whites and Asians, who gave large amounts of money to the sheriff's reelection campaigns. And so, I would say that, that's fine that those wealthy individuals were able to go and protect themselves, but they weren't the ones who were the most likely victims of violent crime. They weren't the ones who needed protection the most. And so anyway, what the Supreme Court said was, look, guys, you can have objective rules for issuing a permit. You can say somebody has to be an adult, you have to pay a fee, you have to do a background check, you can get some training, but you can't go and require that people have to give a good reason for being able to go and have a gun for protection. So that was the Bruin decision. Of course, what's happened in New York and New Jersey and Maryland and California is since then, they've passed laws that say, okay, we'll give you permits, but you're just not going to be able to go and carry it any place. And so, in Maryland, the law that they passed banned being able to carry in any business or restaurant or hotel or church or school or within 100 feet of those places. Well, try driving down a street in any town and not being within 100 feet of one of those types of establishments that's there. So, in New York and California passed similar types of laws to make it say, look, we'll give you permits, but we'll make it so you can't use them. And so those cases now are working their way through the courts. I think they're trying to delay them as long as possible. By the end of the next presidential term, Clarence Thomas will be 80 and Sam Alito will be 78. And I think they think if they can delay it long enough, and if the Democrats win the next presidential race, then they'll go and be able to kind of have a different Supreme Court and sustain these types of new regulations they're putting in.
Well, thank you for everything you've presented. I believe we have some audience questions now. And just in closing, as of course on constitutional chats, we've studied the Constitution. All of us are patriots. We love the Second Amendment. It is staggering when the information is presented in front of you nonstop, as you've been able to do, just how much, not just the principle and the belief in that Second Amendment, but how it's played out in our history, that all of the evidence is in support of the rights that we've been given. So I know we have some audience questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Jewel, and thank you so much, Dr. Lott. We want to give a few shout outs real fast to some members of our audience. We always like to recognize our students in classrooms that are watching with us. And we want to give a special hello to Dr. Robert Brescia at Permian High School in Odessa, Texas. Dr. Brescia has 30 students watching. And Dr. Brescia said also in the comments, hello, John Lott. We had you in Odessa for one of our distinguished lectures 10 years ago. Great to see you're still on the circuit. And so that's from Bob Brescia. Wanted to be sure and tell you. We also have Cami Waynouse watching with homeschool student, Hope Mucklow with homeschool students, and Sherry Stiegel with homeschool students. So if you are a teacher with students watching and we didn't give you a shout out, ping us in the Q&A queue and we'll be sure and say hello. Now, we also want to give a quick, we also want to recognize our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV replays these chats on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to KKVV and all of our listeners in Las Vegas. So Dr. Lott, one question that came in here was, at a time when congressional action on any issue is particularly slow, do you anticipate state and local governments taking on more of a role on gun issues?
Well, I mean, they have been. You have states going in opposite directions on this. You have states like New York and California and New Jersey and Maryland and Hawaii, which try to make it as difficult as possible for people to be able to go and own guns. California probably has the most restrictive gun control laws. On the other hand, you have other states which are making it easier for people to be able to go and protect themselves and defend their families. But I mean, you see the same type of divergence when you're looking at law enforcement type issues. You know, those same states like California and New York and Illinois passed bail reform, which make it so that criminals don't have to put up any or very little bail. You make it so that they've had cuts in police budgets. You've had other rules that make it difficult for police to go and do their jobs. You know, in a city like Chicago, you'll have less than 20% of murders result in an arrest. In some years recently, it's been as low as 13%. You know, nationwide, you're talking about something like about 64% of murders result in arrest. And if, you know, you don't arrest people for the murders, if it's not risky for them going and committing it, and then you don't even prosecute all the people that you do arrest, and you don't convict even some of those that you prosecute, you know, it's not too surprising that you're going to see a lot more murders that are occurring. It's not risky for them going and committing murders.
Well, in keeping with the state theme, John Areola asks, why can states not accept other states' concealed carry permits? A U.S. law says that if you're just traveling through the state you are traveling through can arrest you.
Well, it's not quite true. I mean, you're allowed to travel if you're really just traveling. You know, you're not going to spend the night or something in a particular state if you're just traveling through. But you know, right now it's a case that's winding its way through the courts about exactly what the rules are that you have to have. But you know, generally, you know, if some states may require that you have to have your gun locked in a box, separate ammunition from that, and out of reach. You know, maybe New Jersey or Illinois may have rules like that. And so, you know, you can have the gun, you just maybe aren't going to be able to get access to it when you go and you travel through certain states. You know, if you're just traveling through and you're not going and carry, you know, so like Illinois doesn't recognize concealed carry permits from outside of Illinois. And so if you're just traveling through Illinois, you know, put your gun in your trunk and just don't carry it around when you're walking around there unless you have an Illinois concealed carry permit. You know, similar types of things with New Jersey or Washington, D.C. So it just, you know, you have to kind of pay attention to the laws that are there. But as I say, there are cases now kind of working through the courts to kind of look into questioning some of the regulations on people carrying. But you can have a gun with you. It's just that you may not be able to get access to it when you travel through the state, certain states.
Well, thank you for that. And then one of our students watching, Kenyon Waynehouse, who's 14, asks, what is the usefulness of assault weapon bans? Do they have a place? Or are they just as useless as gun-free zones? Right.
Well, you know, the whole term assault weapon, I think, is kind of misnomer. You know, President Biden will go and point to something like the AR-15, and he'll talk about this being a weapon of war. Even the Associated Press last year came out and said no military around the world use these guns. They may look like a military weapon, but they're semi-automatic guns, which means that one pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out, it reloads itself, one pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out, and so on. An AR-15 functionally is the same as any semi-automatic small caliber hunting rifle, firing the same bullets with the same rapidity, doing exactly the same damage that's there. And the original federal assault weapons ban, you had Dianne Feinstein's staff go through gun catalogs and essentially pick guns based on how they look rather than how they function. Now, Biden many times has talked about banning all semi-automatic guns. And at least, there's some more logical sense to that by banning a category of guns rather than just guns. Frequently something like an AR-15 is referred to a military style. And the key word there is style. It's just that it looks like a military weapon as opposed to actually functioning. Military weapons have machine gun modes, or burst modes, where one pull of the trigger, many bullets or multiple bullets can come out per pull of the trigger that's there. And it's the interesting thing is that if you look at the data, and people can see this on our website at crimeresearch.org, the percentage of mass public shootings that occurred with these so-called assault weapons during the 10-year federal ban actually went up during that period of time, or stayed the same. And the problem is that you can't go and explain any changes, any benefits from an assault weapons ban if the percent goes up, because if anything, those should be the weapons that should be used less frequently in terms of these attacks, if the assault weapons ban is having any beneficial impact that's there. But look, to go and ban guns based on how they look rather than how they function, it's not really obvious why you expect it to have any impact on any type of crime. And even studies paid for by the Clinton administration, which signed the law into effect, weren't able to find any statistically significant evidence that the assault weapons ban had any impact on any type of crime or on mass public shootings.
Interesting. And then Jill Smith asks, can you address how things changed in Australia after they changed the gun take-back laws? How did it impact that country?
Right, sure. Well, it's an example of kind of statistical malpractice. What they had a gun buyback in 1996 and 1997. About a quarter of the guns that were legally owned in Australia were forcibly bought back by the government. The thing is, after that, people were allowed to go and buy guns again. And by 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was actually above what it was prior to the buyback. And so what you should have imagined, if gun control supporters were correct, you should have seen an immediate drop in various types of crimes. And then over time, an increase in crimes as the gun ownership rate went back up. In fact, you see nothing like that. What happens is people look at before and after averages. And let me give you a simple example. Let's say I had a perfectly straight line that was falling over the whole period of time. And I could pick any point along that line, and the after average is going to be below the before average. But I could say, okay, the law changed at some point along that line. It continues falling at exactly the same rate after the law gets passed as it did beforehand. I'd look at it and say, it's pretty hard to see evidence that this actually had any impact on things. The thing is, if you look at firearm homicides or firearm suicides in Australia, those were falling for 15 years prior to the buyback. And so you want to go and say, well, did it fall at a faster rate? Did it fall at a slower rate? What happens? And what was there some discontinuity in the line that was happening there? And what you find is that the rate of firearm homicides actually fell more slowly after the buyback than it did beforehand. So rather than the big drop and then an increase, it kind of stopped falling and then kind of was flat for about 8 years. That's hardly, is the after average below the before average? Yeah, but that's only because it was falling for the 15 years prior to the buyback that you have there. So it's really statistical malpractice. And if you look at total suicides in Australia, there's no evidence that total suicides fell after the buyback occurred there. And so, it's just, anyway, there's just lots of misinformation that's there.
Well, thank you. And we appreciate all your research that helps correct that misinformation. So, and we are just right near the top of our hour here. And so we want to thank you so much for being with us today. And we want to thank all of our audience for being with us today. And we want to invite everybody to come back next week when we're going to be talking about the Third Amendment. And is it still relevant today as we go through our series, Bill of Rights and Current Events? And Jewel, is there anything you want to say here in closing?
Yep, just a great show. Thank you.
Yeah,
Right,
thank you
thank you.
so much, Dr. Lott. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for being on today.
Well, I appreciate it. People can find more at our website, crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. Thank you very much.
And we drop that into the Q&A queue as well, so everybody will have that. So thank you. Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.